This podcast is presented by Boeing, building a brighter future for all with the help of those who served. With support for hundreds of military and veteran-specific programs, Boeing offers opportunities and resources for a career in aerospace. Veterans can use the skills gained during their service directly in their next mission, leading teams in aerospace innovation. Boeing is proud to stand with and support those who served. Learn more about our veteran initiatives at boeing.com/veterans.
And we could use your help.
We?
There's a group of us figuring out next moves, running scenarios. We can't just stay sitting ducks.
Yeah, I noticed the new and improved super goons around.
I got a plan for that.
What would you need me to do?
This. We need help charting the area to get out of here.
Back on that first day, all the guys looked to you. You got the final say. Why didn't you gripe about us bunking in 8?
Well, let's just say I at least knew you weren't spies.
Ain't that a bitch?
Gail Clevin, Major, 100 Bomb Group. Everybody calls me Buck.
Second Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson, 332nd Fighter Group. You can call me Alex.
Welcome back to the Masters of the Air podcast from the National World War II Museum. Joining us this week are Josiah Cross and Branden Cook to discuss with us their roles as Tuskegee Airmen, Richard Macon, and Alexander Jefferson. Hey guys, how are you? It's good to see you, Branden, Josiah. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
So, Lieutenant Jefferson wrote a book, and I know it was very important to you in your preparation. Remind us of the title of the book, actually.
Red Tail Capture, Red Tail Free.
Tell us a little bit about Jefferson's book.
It had a profound impact on not only the preparation, but myself, reading his entire experience, which I can kind of even relate to. I was born in Toledo, Ohio, which is not too far from Detroit. I moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, which is not too far from Atlanta. So I was able to have a familiarity with that story and that transitions for him. But being able to read and understand the mind of who this man was, brilliant, smart man, very talented and skilled in drawing, and he liked building model planes, and it had a really big impact on me for a lot of reasons. I mean, seeing the ins and outs of his struggles. This is still segregation. You know, Detroit wasn't as bad as the South, but Detroit still had its issues. And I think sometimes that's skipped over a little bit when we talk about this period in time where he's still having to go through a little bit of struggle and strife, even in Detroit, which is considered the North. Then he comes down to Atlanta, finishes school, and he's always wanted to be a pilot. His dad told him, hell no. But once he graduated, he signed up for the reserve. And but to see his process and his path as not only a man, but a pilot, and everything he had to go through and how he dealt with it, specifically through drawing. That was his biggest thing. But he had to be careful what he was drawing. He couldn't draw everything or be contraband, essentially.
We show in the series he starts drawing for some of the other Kriegies, so-called,
right?
For cigarettes, and talk about that. And that was so interesting. I love the scene when you're in the bunk and you're drawing the pinup for somebody else's idea of their dream girl. Talk about that scene a little bit.
Yeah, it was a fun scene because he loves drawing. That was a easy way for him to pass the time, and he was able to kind of find a barter system with that. But it was fun, really. I mean, Josiah is great to work with, and just to get into, this idea of the the man's dream girl, but also I'm able to see my dream girl through that as well. I always connect with artists in that way, and being able to express yourself physically with a pen or a paintbrush and stuff like that. So to be able to do that in the show and to let my imagination run wild with that in that scene, I'm almost living vicariously through what this picture represented. That was amazing.
To echo Branden's sentiment, last night made me think about
tell everybody what that last night was.
Oh, our premiere, our world premiere. Yes.
That was kind of fun, wasn't it?
Yeah,
it was.
It was great.
But this specific question, made me harken back to the beginning of our preparation and Alexander Jefferson's book. And I think because Branden is playing literally the man who wrote that book, I was like, man, you got a lot for real, like, because my guy didn't write a book, you know what I mean? So,
right.
And, even, Jefferson in the book, referencing him, and again, they really didn't know each other. And
they did. They ended up building a relationship.
In the various training, throughout their training, they knew of each other.
Yeah, and that's what I meant.
Were not friends yet, but talk about that, Josiah.
And that was like, to Brandon's point, like even for us in the beginning, it's like, okay, who is this guy? And we're about to be together and
wanting to have that friendship.
Exactly. And birthing this kind of kinsmanship, this brotherhood, because we're gonna need it. And I think that the eloquence in Jefferson's book is kind of what helped me shell out, Macon fully, to really put, some bones on him, to really give him some character from like the words of Jefferson, if that makes sense.
One of the key scenes, not only in episode 8, but in the entire series, is when Major Cleven comes in to talk to Lieutenant Jefferson.
Right.
And basically enlist his help. And it's really the first genuine communication that we see between the white airmen and the black airmen. Talk about that scene that you played with Austin Butler.
Yeah, Austin was great. From the very beginning, he was warm and welcoming, which made it easy for me to kind of relax and get into it, because that was, you're walking in with Austin Butler, but he was very welcoming and warm, and we were able to have a little bit of a chat and then go and do what we needed to do. So I was nervous, definitely, but I think I was able to use those nerves in a good way, because there is probably some nervousness that happens. Well, not even probably, there definitely is nervousness there. You're not sure what this interaction is going to be like. We're both in the same position, but are we going to now act together in that position, or are we still going to take these ideas from racist America at the time all the way over here where it doesn't serve us? So I was using all of that to try and feel Cleven out and feel the motivation out and see, am I going to get set up, or is this genuine? Because we have essentially a common goal mentally, but can we get out of our own way of the ideals that America has instilled in us to work together?
The other thing it's interesting, and tell me if it helped both of you guys as actors, in the sense that as you walked in, you said you're nervous. This is Austin Butler. He's a big movie star. Well, of course, in the camp, in addition to the racial element, there's also Major Cleven. He's a major. You're a second lieutenant, so that's right away.
Right.
But also the fact that Cleven was, just as he was at Thorpe Abbott's, a leader and something of a legend. He became that in Stalag Luft 3. So here you are playing this young second lieutenant, and all of a sudden this major, this one of the leaders of the entire camp, is coming in looking for your help. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, you can liken it to the real life situation. I mean, I'm coming in to do my job essentially, but this is Austin and you guys have said, I'm coming in with that as well. And it is kind of a reaching of hand, like, hey, we need to continue this story and we need your help. So I kind of looked at it like that. It's almost meta in that way. And it added so much to the scene, I think, because there is a tension and a pressure that starts and then is relieved. And I think that's how I felt. You know, when I first got there was tension and pressure personally. And it started there, but slowly but surely it was relieved.
You mean like self-imposed?
Self-imposed, yeah. Because everybody was great. I had no issues on set. It was the best experience of my life. But I was very nervous, very nervous. But I was able to relax, just as Jefferson was.
One of the things, Branden, we were talking about earlier is you mentioned that and at Playtone and with Gary and Tom, we're very proud of Band of Brothers in the Pacific. And this is obviously in that lineage. It's from that Masters of the Air is in that's the heritage for Masters of the Air. One of the other challenges you guys have is that by now, I think a lot of Americans, increasing number of Americans, know who at least have some idea who the Tuskegee Airmen were, who the Red Tails were, if not who the 332nd Fighter Group was. But it's been thought of the Tuskegee Airmen have been as a collective,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the Tuskegee Airmen.
Mm-hmm.
But now, as you and I were talking about, Branden, you guys had the chance to stamp individual characters like
Right.
Alexander Jefferson and Richard Macon, like we were able to do with Richard Winters and Carwood Lipton and Band of Brothers
Right.
and John Basilone in the Pacific, etc. Talk about that. And again, these were real guys. So it isn't just playing a generic red tail.
Right.
These are real men. Please tell us about that.
There was I felt a lot of weight and pressure with that, in a great way, because I wanted to bring honor and respect to this hero that, you know, has gotten a bit of due, but not on this scale and this level. As we were talking about earlier, you know, we are now a part of a lineage of great storytelling with great storytellers that are able to do it at a very high level. And to now have the opportunity for Richard Macon and Alexander Jefferson to be a part of that, these real human beings. Yeah, I just felt a lot of pressure and wanted to handle that with a lot of care. And, you know, like we were saying earlier, that's one of my biggest regrets, that I wasn't able to meet him, because, you know, my hope was just that I did him justice and he was able to like it and smile and say, I see myself in that young man that feels like me. And unfortunately, I'll never be able to know that, because he unfortunately passed. But there was a lot of pressure. I felt a lot of responsibility with that, specifically making him human. You know, like you said, they're most of the time a group, or it's kind of generic, but, you know, you guys don't do generic. You guys make sure these are real human beings. We're going to bring them in this story, and it brings that much more depth and touch to it. So I wanted to make sure that I did that justice.
Early on, one of the really key moments in the production, or at least the development of Masters of the Air, is when we discovered that about 20 years ago, there was an oral history project where I believe every living red tail gave an extended interview.
Yes.
We were able to, and we had transcripts from all of them. So we were able, and this really helped us. We knew Jefferson because of his book. He was probably always going to be a character. But Macon really emerged after reading all of the transcripts of all these oral histories. And Macon seemed so interesting. So how helpful were those oral histories, you know, to you guys? Did you guys get a chance to go through those and get some sense of who these men were? Yeah,
there was the videos as well that I got to see. Jefferson did a lot of interviews comparatively to the other people, so that definitely helped me to kind of get who he was. I got a lot from the book. I mean, his personality comes through the book, but those transcripts and those videos helped out a lot to get a little more essence of the man.
Yeah, I think the transcripts for Macon, because I felt so sensitive in every step, because it was a living, breathing man, you know, and there's no reference point in a technical visual way. You don't want to disrespect, in some type of way where I'm just leaning on, my acting ability, and I'm going to, whereas to like, this was someone's grandfather. So those transcripts kind of helped tonally craft what I was able to do, and his mathematicianship, him being a genius at such a young age and knowing how to operate these planes from a numerical sense, being in the air and being able to orchestrate. It's 1,676 miles until we get to DuPont. That kind of like gave me more of the spirit coupled, with those transcripts to where I could kind of feel safe.
And you mentioned age, and I'm asking all of the guys some questions, same questions. Remind us how old Richard Macon and Alexander Jefferson were.
Richard Macon was 19 years old.
Yeah, I think
at the beginning.
At the beginning, yeah.
Around the same.
Yeah.
Young. That about 19, 20.
Imagine.
When I was 19,
I couldn't even imagine. Well, they said last night at the premiere, you were 24, you were an old man. That
Called
was
you pops.
That's shocking to me.
I'm going to ask you who Richard Macon was and who Alexander Jefferson is, not who they were in history, but who you determined they were and how that informed your performance.
I think for me, to truly do that question justice, once all the preparation was out the way, all the research, all the historical contact was kind of like done to the point of no return, then you have to bring the human to the research. And I heard Austin say something interesting last night where there's kind of no room for error in that type of character development. And you must be completely confident in that expression. And for me, Macon, selfless. And I don't want this to get taken out of context, but I think what Mr. Hanks was explaining last night about these being essentially men fresh out of high school, there is a unconscious naivete to what's happening. I personally never even held a gun in my life. You know what I mean? So to imagine operating an airplane, not only operating it, but then having to shoot at other planes with people inside of them.
Not just an airplane, a P-51.
Yeah, that ain't no normal airplane.
In a different context, in Empire of the Sun, the Christian Bale character refers to it as the Cadillac of the sky.
Yeah.
Because it's just so fast and it's so maneuverable. So just to your point, that it's not just shooting a gun, it's flying the best airplane in the world.
Yeah.
And you're 20
Exactly.
years old.
Yeah.
And to just finish who Macon was to me, just selfless, and that selflessness rested in the blissful ignorance
Of youth.
Of youth, and but to be that committed and determined to something he probably couldn't even wrap his mind around, to me was the mark of who he was. And banding himself with these brothers in the beginning, not really, and then forming these lifelong friendships, and brotherhood with these men was who he was to me.
I think Alexander Jefferson to me was he was an artist in every sense of the word. I am in awe when I read his book. I am in awe when I think about who he was as a man. And it's something I strive to have that well-rounded. Like he was truly a well-rounded, honorable individual. And it touches me that I was able to portray him in this capacity.
You guys had a couple of real big challenges, you two in particular. And one of the challenges, how do you come in, you're major characters in our show, but you're introduced relatively late in the game. So we will have already seen 7 episodes where the audience has gotten to know Clevin and Egan and Crosby and Rosenthal. You guys have to come in and make an impact really kind of in the late innings. So as actors, How did that affect your performances and how you prepared?
It was a bit intimidating, I think, at first, because I think one of the first scenes we shot was us coming into the Stalag
prison
3.
war camp.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you had Germans and Americans, and everybody was there as we were literally entering not only this space that you all created, but this war camp. And, Josiah or Macon has a broken neck.
Oh, yeah.
And he did a great job, I remember, of setting that scene of what that really would have been like for Macon. And that helped me right away as well as Shuti, of just dropping in. And the background extras, like the whole scene was kind of set. So where it was intimidating, it was easy to drop in because everybody was there and ready to receive what we were willing to give.
Yeah, I think Branden hit it on the head. From a technical aspect, I would say as an actor, I think the crossboarding with the shooting for me is something I kind of have gotten used to. So in preparation, I'm trying to prepare in a total kind of way where like, if we're dropped in that moment that we were dropped in, it's not linear where we entered the story at that moment in time. And the rest of the guys from the 100th, they were literally lined up on the side because we were walking down that strip. And I think DeMarco was like on the side, and he was like trying to like.
I remember you guys.
Yeah, I remember you guys like seeing us, and it was like, oh, they already are, kind of dropped into the moment, and that kind of set the stage for us to, like Branden is saying, like, okay, they're welcoming us and bringing us in
because we hadn't met.
We hadn't met any of them.
Callum, we hadn't met anybody yet. So, and we were separated literally by a gate, but also before we even started shooting. So, we were still thinking about, we want to meet the guys. And we were literally separated. So to drop, like you're saying, to drop in and walk in like that was almost easy.
Yeah.
We were already separated.
Did you think about what it must have been like for Richard Macon and Alexander Jefferson in that situation back in 1944? Again, because this is... they've been shot down. Now they're prisoners of war, and now they're prisoner of war in a camp of essentially, I think there were about 12 Red Tails ultimately.
Yeah, about 12.
But what was that like? How did that feel, walking in and you're surrounded by all these white airmen?
Right.
And I think the way you guys played it, there was a certain amount of, well, you tell me, was it trepidation? Was it anxiety? Was it uncertainty? What were you trying to convey?
I think kind of naturalistically, the environment itself that Dee provided.
And remind us who Dee is.
Dee Reese, our director, who brilliantly set the stage with such a massive scale, with so much like elegance and grace and nuanced perspective. In her direction, because there was almost this tension that was so thick in the character development with the dichotomy between the white airmen and just me, him, and Shuti, essentially. And we're surrounded, and also these guys in real life are just cups of water, like they're amazing, So when they're like acting, it was kind of like just go with it, because I don't think there was any way to kind of like half step or in between play that I don't want to be mean to you. It's like, that's what it was. And for a lot of reasons out of their control in a lot of ways, where it's like, now we're in this camp together. Racism doesn't matter now. It can't matter.
It doesn't really serve us
at all.
I think the tension, like I said before, was kind of easy, and it was interesting because we didn't really know each other either.
Yeah.
You and Josiah.
Myself, Josiah, and Shuti.
That's Shuti Gotwal.
Yeah.
We were still kind of meeting each other too. So, you know, in real life, they may have known of each other a little bit, but as the actor going into the first scene doing this and not knowing of these people, but first time meeting them, it brings another element because, you know, we did end up leaning on each other like brothers while shooting. You know, a lot
literally.
Literally. So
in your case, Macon's case, literally because of the broken neck.
that as well. So, you know, we start off touching, making sure that he's okay. Like that's a really strong way to start off our time together and really set the stage like that, having to lean on each other, not only with the walk, but with helping him with the broken neck. We all three, Shuti as well, we left feeling like a brotherhood. We left feeling similar to how I think those guys felt. You know, I think that's really special.
I think specifically in the barn scene, I don't want to give too much away, but I think specifically in that barn scene, I think that was a critical and pivotal moment. I remember in Dee's direction, Branden,
A lot of care. Yeah.
Branden, he before you did that, Branden was playing it a little cold, and then Dee was like, caress his neck, and then I remember like looking up at Branden as Macon, and I'm like shaking, and then you know Jefferson is. Are you gonna be all right? You're gonna be all right.
It changed the scene so much that it
changed
great
the entire
direction.
scene, and I feel like for them, that's probably one of the moments that really like sealed it for them.
Thank you, Josiah. Thank you, Branden. Later in this podcast, we speak to historian Matthew Delmont for more on the history and context of the Tuskegee Airmen. But thank both of you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Oh no, thank you.
Thank you for the time.
I really appreciate it.
an honor.
Thank you so much. One of the major events portrayed in Part 8 of Masters of the Air is, of course, D-Day. Joining us now to talk about that, Conrad Crane, a research historian at the Army War College. Welcome, Con.
Thanks. I'm honored to be here. Really honored.
It's great to have you here.
Great to be here. Always great to be in New Orleans.
Welcome back, my good friend Don Miller.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's go back to pre-D-Day. And again, and Eisenhower. So talk more about the fact that General Eisenhower now is essentially in charge of the Air Force, and he's interested in what is his strategic aim? It's to essentially to eliminate the Luftwaffe so they can't oppose the landings, right? Can you guys?
He wants to land the force. That's the whole thing.
And that becomes that odd phrase that they got, or that odd notion that the men in the B-17s were being used as bait. We refer to that in the series. Can you guys talk a little, explain what that was about?
That really comes after, Doolittle is brought in and there's a lot of disruption and Acre goes to the Mediterranean and Spots comes in to kind of fill his role, take over the U.S. Strategic Air Forces. And, they launched this. It's February, beginning in February. They start launching these very violent campaigns to draw up the Luftwaffe. I mean, Jimmy Doolittle goes into, I guess that the story is he goes into the fighter headquarters, and there's a big poster on the board that talks about the main role of the fighters is to bring the bombers home, and Doolittle says that's not right. Your mission is to go kill the Germans, shoot down the Germans, and that. He changes the whole direction of the Air Force. Before this, the fighters had pretty much been locked into the bomber groups, and the Germans would tend to avoid them until they'd have to leave, and then they would attack the bombers. And all of a sudden, Doolittle says, your main mission is to kill German fighters, and it just changes the whole dynamic of the air war. Obviously, the fighter guys appreciate it, but the bomber guys don't. There's all kinds of nasty comments that come out of some of the bomber guys once they realize what's going on and the fact that they are basically become bait, and it leads to some increased stress in the bomber crews, and they do end up doing a number of surveys to try to figure out exactly what's going on with the morale of the bomber crews. But the end result is it again, the Luftwaffe takes heavy losses, and by the time you get to D-Day, you've got a German fighter force where the average experience level of German fighter pilots is like a week or two. I mean, the losses have been phenomenal between February and June. The German fighter force is basically shattered.
They lost 75% of their force in the war. It's incredible, the Luftwaffe. I talked to a German pilot, long retired, back in the 2005, I think it was, and it's now an off-quoted comment. He said, every time I pulled my canopy shut, I felt I was pulling down the lid of my coffin. He said, we didn't have a chance in the sky. They had better gasoline, high-octane gasoline. They were quicker to punch.
You mean the Americans?
Had, quicker to the punch.
Once they get the Mustangs. And
they had the Mustangs very fast. It's almost as fast as the Jet. The Focke-Wulf was the king of the air before that. That's an upgrade of a Messerschmitt. And with these Mustangs, they not only, as Kahn said, they went after the Luftwaffe going in, but they went after them going out, doing strafing missions.
Yep, that's right.
A lot of American aces, almost most American aces are shot down doing strafing missions. Gabby Zabreski and people like that. These are very dangerous missions because of the armaments that the Germans had on the airfields. But what Kahn's describing really is a pilot-killing campaign. And this throws a lot of people off about the bombing. Well, how the bombing couldn't have worked because look at all the planes they continued to produce. Well, they didn't have pilots and they didn't have gas.
Yeah.
When we talked about, and Kahn, you were referring to, there was some real problems for obvious reasons when the strategy changed and the flyers realized that they were being used as bait. Don, in your book, you expand on that. You talk about that there were near mutinous.
Yeah.
There was near mutiny on some bases. And at the same time, and factor this into the discussion, we've talked a lot about the benchmark was 25 missions. You did your 25, you could go home. Well, it was right at this time when Doolittle comes in that he raises it first to 30 and then to 35. And that's to a lot of guys, that would seem like you're changing the rules after the game started. So talk about the morale problems that caused in the early 44.
It kind of made sense because the original crews were there a long time because they weren't doing a lot of bombing. And by the time you get to the pre-D-Day effort, the prelude to D-Day, guys could rotate through in 5 and 6 weeks. They could get their 25 missions and they're flying so often. And Doolittle's point was, you really train the pilots. We're giving them a lot of hours, triple and quadruple the number of hours that these young German pilots are going through in training. Then send them back to the States to train guys. Don't keep them here for the 35.
You got it. And again, these guys that show up in 43, I mean, I mentioned in my book, they're getting this briefing about, okay, you're here, you got 25 missions you get 25 missions, you get to go home, pause. But the average is 6.5. So these guys show up at 43. They're told your chances of completing 25 missions are, and I've gone through the numbers, and 25% is about the right number. 75% of these guys are going to go down.
You really did the research on that,
And it's really and so you look at these guys in early 44, and they're being told you guys are now bait. If they weren't bait before, they were taking those kind of casualties. What kind of casualties are they going to take now, where now they are really bait? But again, it's the decimation of the Luftwaffe that's going to change the whole dynamic.
Doolittle had his own plane, and he would fly around to bases because he's worried about morale. The story at the Hundreds is somebody took a swing at him. And, there's real animosity here. And
was there understanding by the men or the crews of what the strategy was, or did they? They
figured it out. Yeah.
And did that in any way ameliorate the bitterness, or?
Again, they could tell that the German Air Force had become less effective. Their losses eventually do start to drop, and it takes a while. And the casualties in the early days of the February and March of 44 are pretty nasty. But eventually they can start seeing a difference as well. I mean, by the time you get to the end of the war, there's not a whole lot of German fighters up there at all. And
well, let's talk about the actual on D-Day itself. I know in The Longest Day, they make a big deal of they just sent up 2 fighters, and they
had more than that.
I understand that was the movie, but talk about that because, and we mentioned it in the episode, in episode 8, that there really was almost no fighter opposition on the beaches, on any of the 5 beaches. And that's really the proof of the pudding, right? That's what they were attempting to do.
Bernie Lay has a lot to say about that, in his book. I mean, he had been shot down, and he's in France in a small village about 60 miles from the beaches, and he notices how the fear that the 8th Air Force had was twofold. They thought that one part of it was right. Hitler was moving a lot of his fighter force from the Eastern Front to the cities because of public pressure, and that's why he kept the flak guns moving, all the time, even though they were ineffective. And then, what the Air Force feared is they're husbanding these things in forest factories or forest hideaways, and we can't spot them yet, but they're hidden away, and so nobody knows. I opened one chapter of my book with one of the Air Force commanders in a B-17 flying over the beaches just to see if the Luftwaffe will show up. He's not quite sure. They don't think they will. They're listening to what Kahn talked about. They're listening to the pilot reports. They see a delimited Luftwaffe, but they don't know, is this a Hitler trick? Are these planes going to go? And Lay's worried about that as well. He's watching from this hideaway he's in, and he sees that maybe 3 or 4 are up, and that's about it.
Well, part of the whole campaign before D-Day, because they don't want to focus specifically on Normandy, they bomb airfields all over France. I mean, the German Air Force is being destroyed all over France, and again, the impact really shows up on D-Day though. Ironically, because some of the adjustments they make to the bombing's not very effective on D-Day. It tends to go a little bit too deep.
What were they trying to? Yes, of course. So when the B-17s went past the beaches and tried to hit bridges, and what was the purpose of that? And again, you mentioned not very effective.
Well, they wanted to do some things on the beach areas as well, but because they also wanted to be safe, they're trying to make adjustments because they're trying to handle landing craft. But the end result is that the delays they tend to put on their bombing means their bombs are dropping fairly far behind the beaches. So they don't really get the beach support that they're necessary. Obviously, it doesn't have a major impact anywhere, but probably Omaha, where Omaha is obviously the nastiest one. But let's just say that the bombing on D-Day is not as effective as they had hoped it would be. But it is an impressive, that everybody sees the airplanes flying over, and that there's a certain morale boost from that. And it's obvious that it's an Allied. The air belongs to the Allies on D-Day.
They flew differently too. I mean, on the 2 beaches. As Kahn said, they went straight over the landing force, and that was always dangerous. Later in the war, they'll do that down near St. Lo, and they'll bomb their own men. And the Air Force wanted to go in a different way, but anyway, on Utah Beach they used 2-engine bombers, and they bombed straight across the beach, up and down across the beach, horizontally, as it were. And we're much more effective doing that. Yeah.
Well, Don, you've talked a lot about, and it's just such an unappreciated aspect of the entire European invasion of what the casualty rate was for the Allies in let's say January to June of 44 in that buildup. That was their real contribution.
And let's get the British in there with their
that's why I say the Allies.
With their typhoons and things like that. I mean, it's a joint effort, and it's massive. And total Allied, killed, not casualties, about 18,000, and we didn't lose near that many on D-Day, on Omaha, or on any of the British or Canadian beaches. Total. About 5,000, I think, killed. Often isn't enough homage paid to the guys who flew those missions. A lot of them were disappointed that they weren't able to hit their targets on the cliffs of Omaha. And I think a myth arose that the air campaign was not successful. Well, if they're not there, the invasion isn't there. I mean, what army in the whole war was successful without air cover? There wasn't one.
That was the big concern on the D-Day landings. If you didn't have air superiority, they weren't going to happen. I mean, it was just that the whole operation was just too vulnerable to the German Air Force. You had to have that. That's a central criteria for
it's
success.
A maximum for an axiom for Eisenhower. We're not going to launch the fleet unless we have air superiority.
As you said, and so even Harris and Spots were under Eisenhower for that limited period of time.
Yes.
And they objected, though. And talk a little bit about...
Spots not in a big way. You know, I mean,
Right.
He wanted oil, but Harris is complaining all the time that he cannot... See, Harris's idea is very firm that the invasion is unnecessary. We can bomb Germany. We often use the phrase bombing people, into the atomic age or whatever, the Stone Age, I should say. He thought they could do that with Germany.
Well, he wasn't the only one, though, correct? There were Americans who also believed, sort of towards the beginning of the war, certainly, that bombing alone, the ground troops were unnecessary.
Well, Spots believed that originally.
That all you would have to do is go back to that original notion that if you could knock out your enemy's industrial base and destroy their morale, you would never have to land a force.
Well, let's take the fact that bombing is brand new. To a civilian in 1935 or 36, a 4-engine bomber is like an atomic bomb. There's that much fear of aerial bombing, and there's been very little of it in World War I. But it's a fearsome thing. I was just talking to Con last night. We were standing on the balcony of this restaurant. And I said, "You imagine what it's like to be in a city with 1,200 bombers coming in on you, and 1,400 fighter planes." In one big air train, unbelievable. Or a city like Berlin. We had our 9/11. Berlin was bombed 351 times. That's 351 9/11s. Cologne was 75% destroyed. So this is a big deal. They weren't totally out of their minds to believe that you could bomb people into submission.
And if you look at what at the raids eventually over Japan and what we were doing, and the evolution of those massive fire raids, it's a terrible to contemplate.
Can you guys talk about? I've read actually a lot of the German citizens' reaction, where a lot of Germans start to consider this is the retribution. This is the retribution for what we've done to the Jews. This is the retribution for what we're getting because we started the war. How pervasive was that feeling? And what was, Don, you had talked about sort of the sinking morale across Germany.
I don't know, Colin, if you, or Kurt, if you could really put a number on it. But it was there. There's a memoir by a woman named Ursula von Kardorff, and she wonders whether this is retribution from God. In a lot of very heavily Lutheran cities like Munster, and this was the reaction, or for starting this aggressive war and things like this. I don't think it was that way among most of the German population, because when we went in later and did a lot of interrogation of Germans, it was very disappointing to hear that they weren't sorry. They were sorry that they lost. And bombing was effective in another sense. It destroyed the connection between the people and the Fuhrer because the Fuhrer couldn't protect them. Not because the Fuhrer made some mistakes, And there's this one writer for Stars and Stripes, and he made a comment. He said, we didn't defeat the fascism. We took their guns. And he said, fascism is an idea, and it's going to be really hard to kill. It didn't change anybody's mind about the Jews. And but bombing does change people's minds about their connection to a Fuhrer state or their desire to go to war. And that is lasting. Everybody mocks the strategic bomb survey, 220 volumes. I read every one of those damn volumes.
Wow.
And I think I'm the only guy in the history of the world that read them.
You very well could be.
And it's really torture. And lots of bottles of aspirin. But anyway, they make a comment at the end that, for a long time, maybe permanently, the Germans are not going to be eager to go to war or to support foreign wars. And sure enough, that happened. That was a direct effect of bombing. But as far as eliminating the hatred that's the seedbed of Nazi racism, you don't eliminate that with bombing. You're just defeated. And so it's a different thing. It really is. So it's really hard to say. But there are these stories that it's retribution. Now, Thomas Mann, the novelist, did a broadcast from L.A., and a very famous broadcast, and he got out just in time in the 30s, and he said, he basically points a finger at his own people, and he said, you brought this on. And don't forget what you did when you supported Hitler. And he said, I see all those smiling faces at the Nuremberg rallies. He said, the minute you raised your arm in salute to the Hitler, you put your whole family in jeopardy. Don't you think there was going to be retribution? Don't you think you're fighting a murderously powerful country when they rise up? Think of the American Civil War and how the South paid for secession, and it's going to happen to us, and it's going to happen to all of you. That's the decision you made. You put your little children, your grandchildren, in high jeopardy, and when you support the Fuhrer, because he has to win, or your country's kaput.
Bombed or not, obviously there was no rising up against the Third Reich.
And then you have your own children that have been indoctrinated, if they're 17, for 7 years. They're turning their parents in, the Hitler Youth.
Con, how would you sum up the Allied, particularly the American bombing effort campaign against Germany between 1942 and 1945?
I mean, it's been interesting having written about it myself and like Don in the last 20, 30 years. Yeah, it's been, when I wrote my book initially in the early 90s, I was really defending what I thought of superior morality, somewhat of the American approach versus the British and some others. And once you really get into the dynamics of the end of the war, I mean, we really take the gloves off against the Germans in October 44, and obviously against the Japanese in March of 45. You know, it gets to there was actually I read a description of a bunch of guys at a bar in Nuremberg during the trials, and somebody was talking about the fact that the American and British bombing wasn't any different what the Germans had done, and that everybody should be treated the same. And there was, I think it was an American reporter who said, well, all you had to do was give up, and we would have stopped. If we had given up, you would not have stopped. What you had done to the world and all the things you did to Jews and everything else would have continued. So at least we were prepared to end what we were doing, but you were not. And that makes us, and that kind of ended the conversation. I mean, war is a terrible thing. I mean, those of us have studied it for years and years. It's watch what's happening in Ukraine right now. I mean, I know working with the American military, and we talk about how, we're going to fight wars short and get everything done quick. And you watch about what's happening in Ukraine right now as that war goes on and on and on, and the atrocities rise. It's amazing we have any control in war at all sometimes, and you got to look back at World War II and realize that it was. I mean, Michael Howard wrote an interesting essay one time talking about morality and warfare, and it said you got to understand as wars go on that you have less and less options than you think, and I think that. If you look at the World War II and its end result, we achieve victory. We end the war. We make a better world later. But a lot of the actions we do up to that are pretty nasty. And war is a terrible thing, and it's to be avoided. And once you start it, I agree with Curtis LeMay, you want to end it as fast as you can. But what it will take to do that can be terrible sometimes.
Joining us is historian Matthew Delmont of Dartmouth University and the author of Half American, the heroic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad. Welcome, Matt. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Matthew, a significant part of Masters of the Air involves the 332nd Fighter Group, known as the Red Tails or the Tuskegee Airmen. We discovered that during the summer of 1944, a number of Red Tails were shot down and put into the same POW camp as men from the 100th Bomb Group, Majors Clevin, Egan, and others. Taking a step back, can you tell us more about the history of the Tuskegee Airmen?
So when we take ourselves back to late 1930s and the lead up to World War II, once the war has really started in Europe, but America hasn't yet joined in the war, Black Americans all across the country are pushing President Roosevelt, pushing military leaders to desegregate the military. They say this is an affront to our patriotism. They desired to be able to serve equally, to be able to help defend the country, but they're pushed away. Of course, the military throughout World War II is racially segregated. The Marine Corps, for example, doesn't allow any Black Americans to serve as Marines for a whole year until 1942. There was a wave of political pressure brought both by civil rights activists, but also by Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and Pittsburgh Courier. President Roosevelt had to respond to that. When he was running for his third term in 1940, he recognizes he needs Black voters to be able to get into office. And one of the things he agrees to do is establish this initial training program for Black pilots. That's a small step. It's well short of the full integration of the military that a lot of Black Americans were calling for, but it's an important foot in the door. In terms of why it was the Air Corps, the Army Air Corps, part of that was about the dynamics of the different branches at the time. I mentioned earlier, the Marine Corps says no way on any Black Marines at the start of the war. The Navy is reluctant to have Black Americans to serve in any capacity beyond mess attendants until very late in the war, when they finally established some Black officers. The Army Air Corps is selected or identified because it's such a high-profile position, but it's also a part of the military that can be almost cordoned off in some way. You can imagine training a set of pilots and keep them as a separate unit, different from being able to put Black officers on a ship where they'll have to be aligned with everyone else. That's part of what leads the military to select the Air Corps as this site of innovation, so to speak. That's established in spring of 1941. Initially, they're thinking about doing it in Chicago, where it would be a racially integrated setting. They eventually do it in Tuskegee, Alabama. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. becomes the first leader of the Tuskegee Airmen. It's the first cohort that gets trained at the base. And it's really in those first couple of years, 1941 and 1942, that these pilots are demonstrating first to their own white commanders, but then eventually to the rest of the military, and then eventually to all of America, that Black Americans can serve as combat pilots. And it's important to understand what a huge hurdle they had to overcome. The mindset of most military leaders at the start of the war was Black Americans really don't have the intelligence, the skill, the bravery to be able to participate in combat in any capacity, much less be able to fly these technologically advanced airplanes. And so that's what these guys are up against. Some of their own white commanders don't think they have this ability. And even after they first deploy in spring of 1943, after they fly some of their first missions, one of their commanders tries to undercut them by filing an after-action report that suggests they don't have the skill to be able to participate in combat, that they were too timid. They weren't aggressive enough to be able to be good fighter pilots. Then it emerges into this massive public relations battle where you have Black newspapers supporting the airmen and a lot of mainstream white newspapers and magazines siding with these military commanders, saying that maybe it was a mistake to be training Black pilots in this way. And so all of this is kind of working in the background. I think what makes it so powerful that the Tuskegee Airmen not only are skilled and successful in combat, they recognize every time they go up in the air, they're not just fighting for themselves and for their country, they're fighting for the future of Black pilots in the United States. If they had failed, it could have been a whole other generation before another group of Black men were given that opportunity.
We focus on three individuals, three particular men, Robert Daniels, Richard Macon, and Alexander Jefferson. Tell us a little bit, particularly about Macon and Jefferson.
So Alexander Jefferson and Richard Macon were two of the Tuskegee Airmen pilots. There were nearly 1,000 Black pilots that were trained overall during the war years, and just over 300 deployed into combat. Alexander Jefferson was originally from Detroit, Michigan, before he went into the Tuskegee Airmen, and Richard Macon was originally from Birmingham, Alabama. And so I think part of what's interesting when you look at the Tuskegee Airmen is they really do come from all different parts of the country. And they're all coming together for this common mission to try to help America win the war, but also to really prove that Black Americans can take on this role as fighter pilots. And I think Macon and Jefferson are great examples of that. They both deployed about a year after the first wave of fighter pilots deployed. And so part of the Tuskegee training project was having cohort after cohort of pilots who were going through training. But I think what makes Jefferson and Macon's story stand out is that these were two of the Tuskegee pilots who were shot down and were held as prisoners of war. So as we alluded to earlier, on August 12th, 1944, Macon and Jefferson were flying in tactical support on a mission to destroy these radar stations in southern France. And they were both shot down. And that, when they parachuted and hit the ground in France, then they were captured by German troops. And their experience as POWs was unique among the Tuskegee pilots, and it gives us a window to understanding what it meant to serve in the war at the time.
So one of the, as you're saying, yes, the Macon and Jefferson unique in that they were shot down and they were put into the Stalag Luft 3, like so many of the men that we had portrayed. And Lieutenant Jefferson, we focused on him initially because he was mentioned in Don Miller's book, Story of World War II. Don knew him and had interviewed him. And then he wrote his own book, Red Tail Captured, Red Tail Free. And so we knew that he was going to be one of our characters. And then when we read the oral history that a lot of the men gave about 20 years ago, and we read Richard Macon's history and background, we knew we had another one of our main characters. But what was really interesting, I have to say, Matt, was reading about this and reading their own testimony in the oral histories. And I sort of assumed that there must have been some racial friction. That the American military was completely segregated. And then these guys, Jefferson, Daniels, Macon, and I think about 10 or 11 others, were thrown into a completely integrated POW camp. And you would think that's the formula for some real problems. But from everything we've read, including the oral histories that Macon and Jefferson and Daniels gave, there was not much of it. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think it is one of the really curious stories of the war, that these men, these Black pilots, are in an integrated camp. And they both describe not really experiencing any racism from the white pilots they're being held with, the other POWs from Allied Air Forces, but also, maybe even more surprisingly, they describe pretty decent treatment from the Germans who found them, captured them, and were holding them as prisoners of war. You would think with the kind of racist Nazi ideology that Hitler was espousing, that Germany was fighting to uphold, this idea of Aryan superiority, where they quite literally didn't believe Black people and other minorities were human. You would think that they would be treated horribly, but what they said was that their German captors treated them as pilots and as officers, and that was the basis on which they regarded them. They didn't pay attention to the color of their skin, which I think says something about how these different militaries understood how to conduct themselves. That what they saw was the rank, and they treated them in accordance to that. For the white pilots they were captured alongside and held alongside, a lot of the stories from the war said that once the action got going, once people were in combat, or once they were in these harrowing situations like being held as prisoners of war, there wasn't as much racial animosity. It's when things were in rest areas, or when troops were in pubs in England, or when they were in the United States training or on recreation, that's when a lot of the racial prejudice and animosity came more to the forefront. So in many ways, it is surprising that they didn't encounter more racism, but I think it speaks to a larger reality that a lot of these guys were just trying to survive and get back home, and that's what they focused on. And they I think, thankfully, were able to put any personal animosities they might have had, or personal prejudice they might have had, aside and support each other as best they could. As a historian, it's one of the most frustrating things to look back at that time period and see that segregation, racism served no strategic or tactical purpose during the war. It made the American military a less effective fighting force. They were turning away Black volunteers and draftees who had advanced language skills, who had PhDs from Harvard, who had technical backgrounds, who could help win the war. I think the story of the POWs, though, treating each other well, by and large, these individuals wanted to support each other, right? That part of what was frustrating about the maintenance of segregation during the war is it really lowered everyone to the lowest common denominator. It said we're not going to try to integrate the military because we don't want to offend the people who will hold so tightly to these racist beliefs. The people who were in the POW camps are the ones who fought shoulder to shoulder in eventually integrated units later in the war. They knew they had to count on each other, and they knew that they would be more successful if they could rely on the person next to them. And thankfully, eventually the military does get there just a few years later with the desegregation of the military by Truman's executive order in 1948.
At the end of Jefferson's book, he tells us of an incident when he's getting off the ship, and for the last couple years he had fought alongside white guys. He had been in captivity. All these things had happened, and yet when he got off the ship in New York, he faced the same old segregation. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the story he tells is he's on this troop transport ship brought back to the United States. They dock in New York, and he's coming down the plank, and he's an officer. And what he says is he encountered a white enlisted man. I think he said he was a private who's directing the troops on which way to go. And he said, white troops this way, black troops that way. Except he didn't say black troops. He used the N-word.
Right.
And for Jefferson, it was just this moment where he describes his pride and relief at seeing the Statue of Liberty finally being home after all he went through, right? Imagine being in combat, being a POW, surviving all of that. And you're so thrilled to get back to the United States, and then just melting that you're back here and it's the same old, it's the same old crap that you thought you left behind and that you thought you were fighting to make go away. I think, unfortunately, that was the reality for a lot of Black veterans. One of the things I write about in the book is for Black Americans, the war didn't end in 1945. That whole generation of Black veterans came back and they kept fighting. Yes. One veteran said they went from fighting in the European theater of operations to fighting in the Southern theater of operations. They became leaders in the civil rights movement because they wanted to fight for a different kind of America. They wanted actual freedom and democracy, the things that World War II is about. They wanted it to be true for Black Americans here in the United States. And the other thing I'll say about Jefferson is he was one of the key organizers in getting the Tuskegee Airmen reunion started in the early 1970s. Right. And we know more about the Tuskegee Airmen today because they wanted to tell their story. They refused to be silenced or left out of the history books, and he deserves credit for that as well. I think the only thing I would add, just thinking about Masters of the Air and how excited I am for that to come on TV. Part of what was so important about the Tuskegee Airmen, both during the war and why it's important for us to tell their stories today, is it really mattered for these men to be able to prove that Black Americans could be combat pilots in the military. It was an important high-profile position at the time. It's the reason I think the show is going to be so popular when it comes out now, is that everyone deserves credit and thanks for fighting in World War II, but there's something about the act of flying in combat that was powerful and resonated so powerfully. That's, I think, I don't want that to get lost in the Tuskegee Airmen story, that them breaking down that particular barrier among all the barriers that had to get broken down. That particular barrier was a really important one for them to defeat.
Next week, Don Miller and I discuss the final episode of Masters of the Air. And we interview Mark Herzog, one of the directors of the documentary The Bloody Hundredth, which tells the story of the real-life men featured in Masters of the Air.
I think that the audience, when they finish the scripted series, has a yearning for more. I think it's just a natural question mark that needs to be answered for a lot of people when they finish a series, especially a series as rich as this.
And next week, we'll hear more from Tom Hanks and the stars of the series, Callum Turner, Nate Mann, and Anthony Boyle. Masters of the Air is an Apple original series from executive producers Steven Spielberg, Tom Hanks, and Gary Getzman. Next week's podcast is the final podcast of this series from the National World War II Museum.